At first, the voice on the 911 call sounds controlled, almost restrained. But beneath it, there is something else. Something urgent, strained, and deeply unsettling. As a woman tells dispatchers that her husband is dead inside their home, her words tumbling over each other in confusion and fear. And in that moment, what seems like a routine medical emergency begins to transform into something far darker. A story that would unravel into betrayal, secrets, and a marriage unlike any other. Because this was not simply a husband and wife facing the quiet tragedy of a sudden death. This was a relationship born under unusual circumstances and destined to end in violence, leaving behind a broken family and questions that would haunt investigators from the very first hour. And it all begins around 9:30 on the morning of January 12, 2019, in Winter Park, Florida, when dispatchers receive a frantic call from 45-year-old Danielle Redlick, who says she has just discovered her 65-year-old husband, Michael Redlick, lying stiff and wounded on the floor. And at first, she suggests he might have suffered a heart attack, a terrifying but sadly common emergency. Yet almost immediately, the narrative shifts, evolving into something disturbing and difficult to comprehend as she begins describing violence, fear, and a chaotic struggle that raises more questions than answers. And investigators would soon realize that this case was anything but ordinary, because Danielle's explanation changes, her story bending in ways that force police to look deeper into the marriage itself, into the past that led to this moment, and into the last hour before Michael died, when something inside that home went terribly wrong. And as officers rush to piece together what happened, Danielle insists she acted out of fear, describing a frightening confrontation in which she says Michael was choking her, suffocating her, and that she reached for a knife in desperation, only for him to seize it and stab himself. A claim so shocking that even seasoned detectives pause, unsure whether they are hearing a desperate truth or a carefully shaped narrative. And from the beginning, the contradictions are striking, because how does a morning that begins with routine domestic life end with a husband dead and a wife saying he caused his own fatal injuries? And to understand that, investigators realize they must step back years, decades, to the unusual beginning of Danielle and Michael's relationship, a story that defies expectations and challenges conventional definitions of marriage and family. Because long before tragedy entered the picture, Michael had first come into Danielle's life under entirely different circumstances, introduced not as a romantic partner, but as a husband to her mother, Kathleen, a woman battling cancer in the mid-1990s. And friends would later recall how Michael spoke openly about marrying Kathleen, not only for love, but to ensure she received better medical care, a decision that painted him as compassionate, generous, even self-sacrificing. And after Kathleen's death, Michael remained deeply connected to the family, providing support and stability to her children, including Danielle, a dynamic that would later evolve into something few could understand and even fewer could accept, because somewhere along the way, boundaries blurred, emotions shifted, and what began as a stepfather-stepdaughter relationship transformed into romance, a development that shocked friends and relatives alike, leaving many warning Michael that such a union could lead only to trouble. Yet, despite criticism and disbelief, the relationship continued, eventually turning into marriage. A bond Danielle described as genuine love, even while others called it the greatest mistake of Michael's life. And for years, the couple built a life together, one marked by financial comfort, thanks to Michael's successful career as an executive with professional sports organizations, but also marked by tension, arguments, and an undercurrent of instability that would later become crucial to understanding the tragedy. Because behind closed doors, those who knew them say the marriage could be volatile, rocky in ways that go far beyond ordinary disagreements, with warnings, fears, and dark humor about hiding steak knives, hinting at conflicts that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. And so, when January 12th arrives, and Danielle makes that desperate call, investigators are already stepping into a story layered with history, complexity, and emotional intensity. And as Danielle is taken to the hospital for evaluation, police begin their careful questioning, observing her demeanor, noting her concern about her children, her questions about whether she needs a lawyer, and her repeated attempts to understand what happens next, moments that some interpret as natural shock, while others see as calculated composure. And the contrast is striking. A husband dead, a wife calm, controlled, asking procedural questions. And detectives cannot ignore the possibility that something more than panic is unfolding. Because from the earliest moments, Danielle appears aware that suspicion may fall on her, asking if she's under arrest, if she is free to leave, signaling an understanding that this situation is no longer simply a tragedy, but a potential crime. And as investigators listen closely, they begin to sense that the truth may lie hidden in the shifting details, in the subtle contradictions, and most importantly, in what happened inside that house during the final hour before Michael's death, an hour that would become the focus of an investigation filled with accusations, allegations, and deeply conflicting accounts. And as Danielle prepares to describe the events leading up to Thursday's confrontation, the story stands on the edge of revelation, poised between love and violence, between fear and accountability, and between a marriage that once seemed unconventional, yet hopeful, and a morning that ended in bloodshed, leaving everyone asking the same haunting question: what truly happened behind those doors in the final moments before Michael Redlick died? In the days and hours leading up to that January morning, the portrait of Danielle and Michael Redlick's marriage begins to sharpen into something far more volatile than anyone on the outside could fully see. Because while Danielle would later describe her husband as belligerent, distraught, and frightening when he drank, others would remember a relationship that seemed to swing wildly between devotion and chaos. A marriage that began with affection, but slowly became tangled in allegations of control, jealousy, resentment, and emotional strain. And Danielle would tell investigators that over time, Michael's behavior changed, that he followed her from room to room, that she tried not to engage, that she locked herself in the bathroom only to have him break the door open. Moments she described as terrifying and destabilizing, painting a picture of a woman trying to escape confrontation while tension escalated inside the house. Yet even these claims would later be scrutinized carefully, because the narrative of fear must be weighed against evidence, witness accounts, and the complicated emotional reality of their life together. And as detectives peel back the layers, they uncover disputes about alcohol, fidelity, and control that would become central to understanding what happened in the final stretch before Michael died. Danielle insisting he drank heavily and became volatile, while others noticed inconsistencies, pointing to empty wine bottles in the trash and questioning who had actually consumed them. Because friends said Michael didn't even like wine, a small but telling detail that hints at how stories can shift depending on who is speaking. And then there were allegations of betrayal, Danielle saying she discovered emails suggesting Michael had carried on with another woman, a revelation she claimed crushed her and deepened fractures in the marriage, while Michael's supporters insisted those communications were innocent, describing the woman merely as someone he spoke with while seeking advice and emotional support, not an affair. And so the marriage became a landscape of competing interpretations, each side constructing a version of reality shaped by hurt and suspicion. And investigators would later hear about jealousy flowing in the opposite direction as well. Messages Danielle exchanged on social media raising questions about whether she was pursuing career opportunities or personal connections, fueling tension that simmered beneath the surface of daily life. And by the time Thursday arrived in the week before Michael's death, Danielle says arguments had grown intense enough that she left the house with her children to avoid distressing them, recalling that the couple yelled at each other while her daughter watched, and her son stayed behind, a moment she frames as protective, yet neighbors and observers would later describe a pattern of loud confrontations spilling into public view, arguments echoing across the street, voices raised, doors slamming, scenes that suggested a relationship unraveling in plain sight. And still, contradictions remained everywhere, because at Michael's funeral, Danielle delivered a heartfelt eulogy, calling him her best friend and praising his devotion to her. And the children, a tribute so emotional that many in the congregation struggled to reconcile those loving words with later claims of abuse, leaving some to wonder whether the truth lay somewhere in between or somewhere entirely different. And as investigators try to reconcile these opposing images, they return to the timeline of January 2019, when Danielle sits in a hospital room recounting events with visible concern for her children and flashes of anxiety about her own legal situation, while explaining that she and Michael attended their son's football game together the night before, presenting an image of normalcy, family routine, and shared parenting. But she says everything changed afterward when he poured himself a heavy drink and began spewing anger, a moment she describes as the spark that reignited long-standing conflict. And records show she had previously filed a police report accusing Michael of domestic abuse, a fact that lends weight to her later claim that she feared for her life. Yet detectives notice her hesitations, the way she stops speaking, saying she's only comfortable sharing so much, leaving gaps that prompt them to dig deeper and daze. Later, they return to the Redlick home armed with a search warrant. The atmosphere tense as officers secure Danielle and begin collecting evidence, informing her they must obtain DNA samples, a procedure that immediately alarms her because the legal language references a death investigation and possible second-degree murder. And suddenly, the emotional balance shifts, Danielle moving from cooperative witness to anxious subject, asking repeatedly whether she's being charged, insisting she tried to save Michael's life, claiming she performed CPR and passed out from the effort. Statements investigators listen to carefully, while quietly comparing them against physical evidence from the house. And the exchange grows more strained as she becomes defensive, pleading that she did not murder her husband, expressing confusion and disbelief, while detectives calmly explain the DNA collection is standard procedure to differentiate biological evidence. Yet her fear underscores the reality that suspicion has already entered the room. And outside that house, neighbors begin to fill in additional pieces of the story, describing arguments loud enough for the street to hear, confrontations that sometimes unfolded outdoors, scenes of shouting that painted a picture of two people locked in repeated conflict, some saying Danielle appeared to be the louder voice, others suggesting Michael worried about her temper and tried to keep peace, still others insisting they never saw physical violence at all. And this chorus of perspectives only deepens the mystery. Because every relationship has private struggles, yet few end with death, and investigators are left sorting truth from perception, trying to understand whether this was a marriage marked by mutual volatility, by fear, by resentment, or by something even more dangerous building quietly toward a breaking point. And as they assemble timelines, witness statements, and forensic evidence, one question looms larger than all the rest. What truly happened in those final moments, inside the Redlick home, when years of love, conflict, jealousy, and emotional strain converged in a single morning that would leave one man dead and one woman fighting to convince the world she had not committed murder. As detectives dig deeper into the Redlick marriage, the portrait that emerges is increasingly volatile and deeply conflicted, shaped not only by Danielle's claims of fear, but by witness statements suggesting a far more complicated and combustible dynamic behind closed doors, because neighbors and friends begin describing scenes that challenge her narrative, recalling moments when Danielle herself appeared to be the aggressor, when shouting echoed through the street, when tensions spilled into public view. And one neighbor would later say plainly that, on occasion, he had seen her strike Michael, slapping him across the face during arguments, describing her as volatile while portraying Michael as laid back and non-aggressive, a characterization that complicates the story Danielle told investigators. And another acquaintance would go even further, admitting that years earlier, if asked whether any spouse he knew was capable of killing their partner, only one name would have come to mind: Danielle. A chilling reflection that hangs heavily over the investigation as police begin uncovering prior incidents involving law enforcement, including a startling 911 call placed not by Danielle, but by Michael himself a year before his death, a recording that captures his voice asking for help, saying there is a woman who may be a danger to herself or others, explaining he wants officers present to de-escalate the situation rather than respond with violence, a moment some interpret as a husband trying to manage chaos peacefully, while others see it as evidence of a household already spiraling into instability. And records reveal Danielle had previous legal trouble as well, including an altercation with deputies that resulted in probation, details that investigators cannot ignore as they attempt to determine whether this was truly a case of self-defense or something far darker. And still, despite mounting questions, the precise truth of what happened that January morning remains unclear, prompting detectives to turn toward the people who witnessed the marriage most intimately, the children, hoping their memories might illuminate the reality of life inside the Redlick home. And when officers sit down with 11-year-old Sawyer, they approach carefully, asking about the previous night, about the football game his father coached, about whether Michael was supposed to be there that morning. And the boy explains he had gone to a sleepover after the game and noticed tension between his parents before leaving. An understated but significant detail suggesting conflict had already begun building before dawn, while other observers would later paint an even more dramatic picture, describing Danielle throwing eggs at Michael's car as he arrived home, an act interpreted as anger boiling over into open hostility. And Sawyer acknowledges he had seen physical confrontations before, describing pushing and scratching between his parents, suggesting a relationship where arguments sometimes crossed the line into physical struggle. Yet, even in those moments, he indicates Michael often pushed away rather than struck back, a distinction investigators note carefully. And then comes the interview with 15-year-old Jaden, whose perspective reveals years of instability, separation, and emotional strain. explaining her parents had lived apart at times and argued frequently, leaving her caught between competing stories and loyalties. A teenager navigating a fractured household where each parent confided grievances about the other. And she describes the past year as especially tense, recalling disputes over possible relationships outside the marriage. Her father meeting another woman while separated, her mother hurt and suspicious, and even arguments triggered by social media messages when a stranger complimented Danielle's photo. Incidents that fed jealousy and mistrust on both sides. Yet, Jaden's testimony introduces a crucial and unexpected detail. When asked about violence, she says she rarely saw her father hurt her mother, but had seen marks on Michael caused by Danielle, once when she struck him while wearing a ring. Statements that surprise investigators because it is unusual for a child to identify her mother as the instigator, and although she remembers her mother claiming Michael pushed her, she wonders whether those pushes were defensive, raising the possibility that confrontations escalated in ways neither side fully controlled. And as police assemble these accounts, the marriage begins to look like a volatile mixture of resentment, jealousy, alleged infidelity, and mutual confrontation. A combination that experts know can ignite into tragedy when emotions peak, especially when alcohol is involved, and friends recall Michael making uneasy jokes that everything would be fine as long as I hide the steak knives. A comment that once sounded like dark humor, but now feels chillingly prophetic, because by January 2019, that warning seems to echo forward into the moment. Investigators arrive at the house and begin processing the scene, noticing something immediately disturbing: the smell of bleach, the unmistakable scent of cleaning, agents lingering in the air where a violent struggle supposedly happened, suggesting someone attempted to wipe away evidence, and forensic observations deepen suspicion, revealing Michael had been stabbed in the shoulder and bled heavily. Yet the blood had dried by the time authorities arrived, implying a significant delay before the emergency call was placed, a timeline that contradicts Danielle's claim of frantic, immediate response and raises a haunting question about what happened during those missing hours, whether someone panicked, whether someone tried to stage the scene, or whether events unfolded in a sequence still hidden beneath layers of conflicting testimony. And as detectives revisit Danielle's original 911 call with these discoveries in mind, every word takes on new significance, every pause and explanation re-examined under the lens of evidence, because the investigation is no longer simply about a tragic death inside a troubled marriage. It has become a puzzle of motive, credibility, and timing. And step by step, piece by piece, investigators begin to wonder whether Danielle's claim that Michael stabbed himself can withstand scrutiny, or whether the truth of that January morning points instead to a deadly confrontation where anger, fear, and years of unresolved conflict collided in the final hour, leaving behind not only a crime scene but a family shattered and a mystery demanding answers. As investigators replay Danielle Redlick's 911 call again and again, one small but critical detail suddenly changes the entire direction of the case. Because in the middle of that frantic conversation, she reveals something that immediately captures detectives' attention. Michael had not just died moments earlier, as one might expect from a desperate emergency call, but the altercation had actually happened the night before, a revelation that introduces a disturbing gap in the timeline, nearly 11 hours during which Michael lay bleeding while Danielle remained inside the house. And for investigators, that delay raises the first of many troubling questions, because if her husband had truly stabbed himself during a terrifying confrontation, why wait until the following morning to call for help? Why not dial 911 immediately? Why not call paramedics? Why not attempt every possible measure to save his life? And instead of clear answers, the story grows even more complicated. Danielle, telling dispatchers they had argued that things had spiraled out of control. Yet her earliest claim was that Michael had somehow killed himself, a version of events that detectives quickly find difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence emerging from the scene. And as they begin reconstructing those missing 11 hours, what they discover becomes the foundation of the prosecution's theory, because while Danielle later insists she spent the night hiding in the bathroom terrified for her life, investigators uncover indications that something very different was happening during that time. Evidence suggesting the house had been partially cleaned, a sharp smell of disinfectant lingering in the air, surfaces wiped down in ways that appear inconsistent with someone paralyzed by fear, and forensic analysis revealing that Michael had been bleeding for hours before the call was placed. A delay that transforms a possible act of self-defense into something prosecutors would later argue reflects a consciousness of guilt. And the troubling discoveries do not stop there, because digital evidence reveals Danielle had been using the internet during those same hours, even visiting a dating site while her husband's body remained in the house. Behavior that investigators say could deeply affect how jurors interpret her state of mind, though defense attorneys would later argue that trauma can produce unpredictable reactions and that unusual behavior alone does not prove murder, reminding everyone that people respond differently to extreme stress and fear. Yet the accumulation of inconsistencies continues to build. And about a week after the stabbing, Danielle is arrested for violating her probation, giving detectives another opportunity to question her about Michael's death, though she remains guarded and reluctant to provide further details, forcing investigators to rely more heavily on physical evidence and timelines rather than her account. And as the investigation progresses, the legal consequences become increasingly serious, because roughly a month after Michael's death, Danielle is formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder, along with tampering with evidence, a charge that does not require proof she planned the killing in advance, but instead that she acted with a depraved mind and disregard for human life, a legal standard prosecutors believe fits the circumstances surrounding Michael's fatal stabbing. And once she is in jail, awaiting trial, Danielle makes another decision that surprises many observers. She rejects a plea deal that could have reduced the charge to manslaughter and resulted in a 10-year prison sentence, a choice that suggests she believes she can convince a jury that she acted in self-defense, that the years of alleged abuse and fear will explain her actions and absolve her of criminal responsibility. Yet the risks of that gamble are enormous, because accepting the deal would have guaranteed limited time behind bars, while rejecting it opens the door to far harsher punishment if convicted. And during recorded conversations, she expresses frustration about evidence investigators have collected, mentioning notes Michael had allegedly written documenting arguments during a possible divorce dispute, hinting at damaging information from his past she believes the court may exclude, suggesting her defense strategy will involve portraying Michael as volatile and abusive, though prosecutors counter that such claims lack corroboration and cannot erase the physical facts of the crime scene, and they emphasize that even if someone argues self-defense, they are not denying the act itself. They are admitting they killed someone, but insisting it was necessary to save their own life, a legal threshold that requires jurors to believe the threat was immediate and unavoidable, something investigators say the evidence simply does not support, particularly given the signs that someone attempted to clean the scene before calling for help, because under the law interfering with a death investigation wiping surfaces, removing evidence, altering the environment, constitutes tampering with evidence. A felony on its own that carries a potential sentence of years in prison regardless of the murder charge. And from early in the investigation, many observers suspected that at minimum, Danielle would be convicted of that offense due to the unmistakable presence of bleach inside the house. Though the greater question looming over the case remains whether prosecutors can convince a jury that the stabbing itself was intentional and criminal rather than defensive. And as Danielle prepares to face trial, she appears confident she can challenge the state's narrative, even suggesting to others that the evidence against her is exaggerated and that a jury might ultimately believe her account of fear and survival. Yet by June 2022, the case finally reaches the courtroom where both sides will present their version of the truth. And prosecutors waste little time outlining their theory that Danielle plunged a knife into Michael's shoulder during a heated argument, a wound that caused him to bleed to death inside their suburban home, describing the scene as something resembling a horror movie once investigators discovered the extent of the bloodshed and the attempts to clean it. And in their view, the most powerful proof of guilt is not only the fatal wound itself, but the actions taken afterward. The delay, the cleanup, the altered story, because they argue that manipulating a crime scene and hiding evidence reveals the state of mind of someone who knows exactly what they have done. And as the trial begins, jurors are asked to confront a haunting question that has lingered since that morning in January. Was Danielle Redlick a terrified woman defending herself from a violent husband, or a calculated killer who tried to erase the evidence before anyone could uncover the truth hidden inside that house? From the prosecution's perspective, the story they present to jurors is stark, methodical, and deeply unsettling, built on the belief that Danielle Redlick did far more than simply defend herself. They argue she acted deliberately and then tried to escape responsibility through deception and cleanup, telling the court the evidence will show she engaged in a significant but ultimately failed attempt to erase what happened inside that house. Because, they say, her explanations never made sense from the beginning. Shifting from claims of a heart attack to the extraordinary suggestion that Michael somehow stabbed himself, and investigators testify that based on the original emergency call and early conversations, they initially understood Danielle to be saying, "Michael caused his own death," a claim that quickly unraveled once autopsy results contradicted that narrative, and pointed instead to homicide, exposing a pattern prosecutors describe as changing stories designed to fit emerging evidence. And this inconsistency becomes a central theme of the state's case. How can someone truly acting in self-defense fail to mention self-defense when speaking to police? How can a victim of immediate danger wait hours to seek help? And why? Would the physical scene suggest deliberate alteration rather than panic? Questions prosecutors repeat again and again as they introduce forensic findings from inside the home. Towels piled near the stairs, a mop stained with blood, a bucket filled with pink liquid consistent with diluted blood and cleaning solution, knives recovered from multiple locations, including a doorway and kitchen sink. And together, these details form a narrative of manipulation rather than emergency, persuading the state to lean heavily on physical evidence rather than emotional testimony, while also presenting communications from the marriage itself to demonstrate underlying resentment and anger, including a chilling email Danielle sent months before. The stabbing, in which she described bitterness, betrayal, and emotional trauma. Words prosecutors argue reveal a deteriorating relationship and a motive rooted in conflict, and they construct A timeline in which Danielle used a large knife to stab Michael, leaving him to bleed for hours. Behavior, they say, reflects intent and consciousness of guilt, portraying the aftermath as the actions of someone attempting to hide her tracks rather than summon help. Yet when it is the defense's turn, the narrative shifts dramatically, transforming the same events into a story of fear, desperation, and survival, because defense attorneys know their strategy must reframe Michael in the minds of jurors, emphasizing the unusual and controversial nature of a marriage between a man and his former stepdaughter, hinting at imbalance and control, and urging jurors to see Danielle not as aggressor, but as victim pushed to the edge, arguing that on January 11, 2019, Michael was the one who became enraged, who attacked, who choked and smothered his wife until she believed she might die, insisting she had no choice but to defend herself. And they highlight that the fatal wound was to the shoulder rather than the heart, suggesting it was not a calculated kill shot but a desperate strike meant to escape danger, reinforcing Danielle's claim that she recognized the threat, that night as different from past conflicts, more severe, more terrifying, and requiring immediate action. And when Danielle herself takes the stand, the courtroom grows still as she answers the most critical question directly. Yes, she stabbed her husband, but she insists she did so because she feared for her life, describing being pinned down, unable to breathe, convinced he had snapped. Her testimony painting a vivid picture of struggle inside the kitchen, of being grabbed from behind, slammed against a counter, held down while she searched frantically for any means of escape, and she recounts reaching blindly into a drawer, pulling out a knife, pleading for release, believing that if she did nothing, she might be smothered to death. A narrative designed to place jurors inside her fear and force them to consider whether a reasonable person in that moment might have acted the same way. While supporters of Michael counter that he had often claimed he merely raised his hands defensively during arguments and never struck her, suggesting instead that he may have been restraining her rather than attacking. A stark contradiction that leaves jurors to weigh credibility against emotion. And Danielle continues describing the moment she raised the knife toward him, saying he grabbed her chin and pulled her back, that she could not free herself, that she believed the danger would not stop. Testimony that becomes the emotional centerpiece of the defense, because self-defense hinges not on perfection, but on perceived necessity. Yet prosecutors press hard during cross-examination, shifting focus from fear to motive, asking whether Danielle was already envisioning life without Michael, whether she wanted peace beyond the marriage, questions meant to suggest she had reasons to want him gone. And the tension rises as the courtroom confronts the ultimate issue, whether her actions were driven by survival or by something darker. Because if jurors believe she could have escaped without using a weapon, the claim of self-defense collapses. But if they accept that she truly feared death in those final seconds, the legal outcome could change dramatically. And as testimony concludes, the case stands balanced between two irreconcilable narratives, one portraying a calculated act followed by cleanup and deception, the other a desperate response to a violent assault, leaving jurors with the heavy responsibility of deciding which version of that night reflects the truth hidden within the final moments of a marriage that had long been unraveling behind closed doors. In the final stretch of the trial, the tension inside the courtroom turns electric as prosecutors press Danielle Redlick on the single issue they believe exposes the truth: time. Those 11 silent hours when Michael lay bleeding on the floor and help never came, and their questions land with force, asking how she could stand inside that home with the power to call for rescue and yet wait through the night, forcing Danielle to explain that she believed he had already bled to death and that she was confused, uncertain, even wondering whether recovery might somehow still be possible. Testimony that immediately creates a contradiction the prosecution seizes upon. Because if she thought he could be saved, they argue, why was nothing done immediately? Why no urgent call? Why no desperate attempt to bring paramedics racing to the scene? And instead, they paint a devastating picture for jurors. A husband dying while his wife cleaned blood, gathered towels, and even browsed the internet. Conduct, they say, shows she was no longer acting out of fear, but making choices that allowed him to die. Yet, Danielle pushes back, insisting she never wanted him dead, and even held on to hope the situation might not be as catastrophic as it appeared, acknowledging she considered the possibility of a heart attack and admitting that such a conclusion would have meant she was not responsible. A statement prosecutors present as revealing motive, while the defense frames it as human panic and denial. And legal observers note that juries can be unpredictable in cases like this, because Danielle's decision to testify gives her the chance to explain the chaos of that night, to describe a tumultuous marriage, to justify her actions in emotional terms, and sometimes hearing directly from a defendant can reshape how doubt forms in jurors' minds. And when deliberations finally begin, the wait feels agonizing. Yet, after only 4 hours, the jury returns with a verdict that shocks many watching: guilty of tampering with physical evidence, but not guilty of second-degree murder. A split decision that leaves the courtroom stunned. Some believing justice has not been served, others emphasizing respect for the jury's role and the high burden of proof required to convict someone of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the verdict suggests jurors believed Danielle altered the scene, yet were not convinced. The state proved she intentionally killed Michael, an outcome rare enough to spark intense debate about how evidence, testimony, and perception collided in this case. And Danielle ultimately receives a sentence of less than a year in jail, with credit, for time already served, followed by probation, meaning she walks free far sooner than many expected. A result some interpret as her taking a gamble on herself and winning, while others view it as a painful reminder that courtroom truth and emotional truth do not always align. And as the legal chapter closes, the human cost becomes impossible to ignore, because friends and relatives reflect on Michael's life and the controversial decision years earlier that shaped everything that followed, marrying his stepdaughter, a choice some believe set the stage for tragedy, a decision they wish they could undo if time allowed. Yet life moves forward for Danielle as she speaks about focusing on the children and honoring what she believes Michael would have wanted, remembering his pride in their achievements and the affection he showed. As a father figure, even as the family remains fractured and in one of the most heartbreaking turns, Danielle's daughter Jaden submits a powerful letter to the court rejecting her mother and asking for distance, claiming others may be fooled, but she is not. A plea that underscores how the verdict may have ended the criminal case, but did nothing to heal the emotional devastation left behind, because what remains after the headlines fade is a shattered household, children caught between grief and loyalty, and a story that closes not with certainty, but with lingering questions about love, anger, truth, and the irreversible moment when a troubled marriage crossed a line from conflict into fatal violence, leaving a silence that no verdict could fully resolve.